I'm your host, Jess Carter, and on this episode of Data Driven Leadership, we're diving into data governance programming. Specifically, we want to look at the advantages of data governance frameworks and what they can and should bring to an organization and when to use them. To help me solution on the spot is Paola Sabini, Principal Consultant of Data Governance Practice at Resultant. Hey, Paola, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you. Well, so before we get started on our solution on the spot, I have a couple quick questions for you. Why data governance? How'd you fall in love with it? Why data governance?
It's the glue. It's the glue that makes you run faster. And a lot of folks just don't know how to leverage. They don't know how to implement it well. They don't know how to bring velocity from it. And as a former practitioner of IT and strategy and delivery and operations and all of that packaged together for many years, somebody told me, hey, take a look at governance many, many moons ago. And I remember Gartner promoting it heavily over 20 years ago, saying, hey, business value and governance are your basic equations components. And when I started using it, I realized, wow, this is an accelerator if you use it well.
Wow. Very cool. What's your elevator speech when someone's like, what even is that? What's data governance?
Think of a Formula One race and think of the pit crew, the pit stop crew. So how good are they? You're running at a really great pace. You're ahead. And then you have the crew that just takes 4 or 5 minutes changing your tires. You can't afford that. So what we bring to the table is a methodology that is fresh, dynamic, holistic, really dynamic, that actually makes us be so in sync with the client that we do not slow them down and we give them exactly what they need so they can keep on running the race.
Very cool. You do not know this, but I'm going to share it because I just think it's cool. I had the pleasure of being on a test pit crew in the last 6 months. And one, it is bizarre how simple some of those things to do are, but one, how hard it is to do under pressure. Like I dropped the gun so many times because it was like pressure was on and I was nervous. And two, the amount of improvement you can make when you do have these like small isolated things that are coordinated, synchronized, critical paths out. So I hear you on that. That's a good analogy of both. There is a bunch of data around Formula One, and there's a whole bunch of improvement you see from the business value and the way the data is used. So it makes sense to me that you use that as an example. And then how long have you been in love with it? Like how long have you been doing data governance stuff?
I have been in executive roles for most of my career, so specifically data governance and that alone only for about a couple of years, but I have had to run governance programs all of my career. So that's why I know that they need to be calibrated well. So they need to be in sync with innovation and risk management. They need to have the controls fused. So think of, with your analogy and your experience and what you just went through, how many steps were there from actually grabbing the equipment to the car? And were you running in parallel with folks? Were you all trying to get to the same part of the car at the same time? Did you know exactly that orchestration is actually controls and frameworks? And that could be privacy, that could be risk, that could be cloud, that could be AI, it could be ML. So you orchestrate all of those controls. So with one movement, you can comply and accelerate at the same time with all of those simultaneously.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, they're going to choose to do that with someone who isn't Jess after they saw my performance. It was so bad. But I at least have a cool picture that I will show you at some point of me next to one of the cars because it was just a really cool experience. And it gets your blood pumping and you get excited about the opportunity. And I think that's where you probably have those moments in your whole career. You're like once people get latched onto the concept and the quick value you can find, it gets exciting and fun, right?
Yes, exactly. And it stays. And they pass
Cool.
it on.
Good. Okay. Well, okay. So here's, you good to solution on the spot? Okay. All right. Let's do it. So, all right. So we're going to be, in this scenario, Paula and I just grabbed a cup of coffee and some lunch. We're on our way to a new client site. We sit down in the board meeting. They've got tons of data. They are using it all the time. They've got a whole bunch of organizational data-driven metrics that they're looking at. It's near real time. It's crazy. It's exciting. It's a fun place to be. Paula has mentioned at a conference, hey, what's your governance strategy, or what does your data governance programming look like? And they're like, we don't even know what that means. So we're walking in together to have this opening conversation about where do we begin if we care about data governance, and should we? Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Yes.
All right, where do we start?
Well, one of the key questions to ask from the board and from the C suite is what kind of information is extremely valuable to you and why and for how long? So there is information that is tied to
Mm,
shareholder value or stakeholder value that maybe is good for a quarter or for 6 months.
yeah,
There's information that is vital for, and I'm staying at the information level now, haven't even gone to data yet. Information
right.
that is vital for operations, for business continuity. And then there is information that is tied to key insights, competitive
Yeah,
advantage, or citizen driven initiatives that are going to be pivotal. So let's do some math around those. What are the numbers? And then finally, another question for them is imagine, God forbid, that you had ransomware hit you. What are you willing to lose and for how long and why? And once you get to those answers, then you've got your structure for
mm,
where to apply data maturity and data governance and how to make sure that you are anchoring the value of those data sets associated with that information and mitigating risk as well as helping innovate.
great. So when I think about some of the dynamics at play here too, is in that kind of a dynamic, there's also the question of, hey, where are you getting some tension in the organization? Because there, and maybe I'm leading you to your next level of depth, or maybe I'm missing a step. So tell me. But there's this level of, I can imagine an executive that says, hey, I'm asking for reports and they're contradictory. They don't all align. People aren't using the
That's
same
right.
data, I guess, because I've got one person saying that this line of services is, amazing. And the other one is like that it's $2 million different. It's 20 million, $200 million different. Where's my source of truth? How do I know what's going on? I got data everywhere. How do I know if it's good or right or trustworthy? Like where does that enter into governance plant programming?
That is has a simple business fix. So a lot of folks will try to just slap on a tag that says this is a source of truth, the source of real information, system application, etc. What you really need to do first is to step back and get the person that knows the data the most, or the people that know the data the most, that deal with it day to day. Tell us the story. Let's start from the
Mm,
very beginning. How does it get captured? Who, where, for what reason? How does it get collected? All the way to the final disposition. How does it get purged or not? And who touches that along the way? How many vendors or outsourced parties come in and manipulate that data? How does it get transformed? In
mm,
which environments? The business rules. This is all a non-technical story. You would be blown away by how few organizations have that. In
yeah.
fact, I can tell you that data scientists normally will say, I'm a little hesitant because I'm building things and I wish I know the beginning of the story and I wish I knew how it's going to end. I'm passing this on with caveats and disclaimers because I'm not sure if this
Yeah.
is the right data for the information I'm being asked.
That's like amazing and so relevant. And it's interesting to your point, how much of that is not even technical yet. That's like learning the story of the data, learning the story of how the business is running based what the interactions between the business and the data actually are. What role do their systems play in a governance program?
The roles of the systems administrators and systems engineers, they are really the ones that are enabling the conduit and enabling the network, the passing through of that data. But it is exclusively the task of the business, whether it's operators, creators of data, collectors, transformers, to be able to declare the importance of it, so the conduit is appropriate, the residence limit, so the storage is appropriate, and being able to say it is going to end up in figures that are going to change the company radically or not. So now it
Mm,
needs to have a different level of curation. Now the metadata needs to be a lot stronger and a lot richer. And by the way, we're thinking of monetizing that. So now the legal aspects and the partnerships kick in and the story continues. Imagine of data. We hear this all the time, data as an asset. I don't believe it is an asset anymore. I think it is data as a product and data
Mm,
as a service. So if it is a product, you're constantly shaping it and improving it and enriching it. And you're making this a very healthy product because the marketplace will demand it to be better and better. That
yeah,
marketplace is inwardly or it is outwardly. And then if you're going to sell it, then it's data as a service to some extent. And by sell, I mean even sharing with a partner, with a business partner. So it has
yeah.
to have a level of curation.
How do you, so I'm thinking about all the different stories in my handful of years of consulting, and every state agency, municipality, or private client I've worked with seems to have such a different story in their data governance journey, what that looks like, what the realities or challenges are. And so it's really interesting to hear you explain some of this. How do you keep, um, for this client too, like how do you keep data governance feeling like something that's just going to keep exploding and taking up more and more time, energy, budget? How do you make sure that it's a well-run, efficient program and you can get kind of organizationally some arms around it to make it stable?
So the business value equation will give you the key data sets. And my recommendation is always to stay very narrow on those key data sets and go very deep. So by going very deep is get that metadata so rich that it tells a
Mm,
fabulous story, that it course corrects all kinds of things, that it solves mysteries that have been probably around in the enterprise for a long time, and it solves chronic issues. But if you
yeah,
expand that scope of how many data sets, you have to have a compelling reason, because now you're stealing time from those data stewards that could be spending time in the other more valuable data sets. So the business has to declare what's important now, what's important later, and for how
yeah,
long.
yeah. When you brought this up in a different conversation, I mean, if we're meeting with this client and they're trying to really seek to understand how what we would define data governance programming, in your opinion, like, what are the kind of some of the conditions in which you would say, hey, you really need a data governance program, or you really need to mature it. It's time for some maturity and around some of these things. Like, how are you tinkering with that as a consultant?
Yeah. Nowadays, the answer on my part would be different from maybe 5 years ago. We have such a strong reliance on instance and forecasting and predictions that one of the questions I would ask is, how well are you doing on your predictions? Right? Is that over
Great.
50%? Is that 60? Is that 80? And it could that be that you don't really know the whole story of what's happening with the data. So data governance is about decisions on the data and about rights on the data. Decisions are very driven by goals and objectives, and then access rights are driven by transformation needs and usability, etc. What you have when you have people ask, well, how much or how little should I implement in data governance, that's not necessarily the right question. Is your pain point something that you're willing to live with? And if the culture accepts it, then you're willing to live with it.
Yeah,
And which ones are the areas where you have to pivot, you have to change, and just start there. We right size it for them so that they want to come back for more because they see the value right away. There's
that's
depth of
great.
that.
That's great. Okay. So say they sign at the dotted line. They're like, "Oh my gosh, we know in this situation we know we need it, or we know we need some maturity around our data governance." Um, in your experience looking at organizations that are trying to either mature it or stand up a program, what are some of what's it feel like? What's the experience for a client? Like, give them a sense of, hey, give this client a sense of, here's how it's going to feel. Here are the times it's going to be really exciting, times it's going to be really tricky.
They have already, I think that they have a predisposition to think that it's going to be very boring and disruptive, and it's going to take a lot of time. So we have an obligation to make it exciting. It's not a choice.
I love it.
And what we do is we are very clear on the time commitment. We actually start with the logistics. From so and so, just an hour and a half a week, and we will honor that. From these other parties, just 30 minutes, and those are just emails and decisions. From these other parties is two times a month that you're going to meet, and that's a couple of hours. So that perimeter gets carved, and it puts them at ease so that their thinking is not, okay, I like it, but how long? How bad is it going to be with everything else I'm holding? Once we
Yeah.
have that perimeter carved out, then we go with that deep assessment of what is important. From there, we walk away with an exact quantification and qualification of how every single aspect of a data governance activity is going to map to a KPI. If we cannot map it to a business KPI on that activity level, then it's not worth doing. And this is why somebody will be asked a year later, we funded that. What did you guys do? Then they would also say, I know what you did, but what is it worth? How does it
Yeah.
help the execs? And then they'll say, I don't see the results. So you work your equation backwards again. Map it to the KPI, be obsessed with showing value exactly where it matters, and then make sure that you frame and you scope the amount of time and effort placed into it and quantify the use of good tools. You can do this manually, it's a nightmare, or you can use good tools, and not every tool is good for that organization. Look at the culture. Do they like to read? No. Do they like to watch videos? Maybe not. Just fine tune it to find that to get the right tool for them,
Great.
and they will adopt it.
That is amazing. Is there, as we wrap up the solution on the spot and wrap up with this client, is there anything I haven't asked or we haven't talked through that you think would be important to mention?
Normally, the regulatory obligations are such that they may rely on friendly auditors, that they're hoping that they don't get asked certain questions. And those obligations may actually be coming from the security side of the house and be coming from plain compliance. In the case of manufacturing or transportation, they have very specific regulations and many other industries and sectors. But what the data governance function can do very easily is help them comply with those quickly
Hmm.
by virtue of having active metadata. So
Yeah.
imagine a lawyer that is in charge of running a records management program. They don't have staff. They know that they have to declare records. And by records, I'm using the legal term here. That normally gets postponed and badly tackled. Why not have a steward right off the bat? Just put an R on the metadata for that tag and
Right.
say this happens to be a record. And by the way, throw in the InfoSec classification, throw in the privacy regulations, and while you're at it, start ranking. Does this make it to a dashboard that the top executive looks at? Now it
Right.
has a score of X. Okay, so more data stewards come in. Why am I bothering to come and curate this data? Because it has a score of 7. So
Yeah.
take a look and spend time. It begins to form into a nice fabric of meaning behind the data.
You you brought up metadata, which we hadn't talked about yet, and the some of the experiences that I've had around data governance are large entities, usually in the public sector, that have both some of their own data, but also some federal data, and how those are protected and the rules around how you can use them are highly complex. And they found that as if they had that metadata governance, they could really easily manage and understand what data was highly desired and what the scenarios or use cases were in which they could actually allow access to that data, or how could we design meaningful solutions where people could see it, but it was protected and it was autonomized and you couldn't re-identify somebody. And so I think that metadata piece is really important because if you can start to understand, to your point, and I maybe you need to do a quick definition of metadata. To me, I just as a pragmatist, it's been data around the data. It's the data around the data that we're using, and so you have a source system with that data, but all this stuff about when was it entered and what is it used for and what kind of reporting, having the data in a system, say you are in the public sector, where you can identify which fields directly impact a federal report. That makes someone's life so much easier.
Tremendously. Having worked in government for almost 12 years, I can tell you that even down to the level of getting better grants or
Yeah.
fulfilling those grants or being able to show to the citizens and residents that you have indeed created good outcomes and impact from
Yeah.
those efforts. Metadata is that fuel
Right.
behind it, and it describes the data, but it also is able to get quantified and qualified along the way. So it runs its own story that also allows people that are trying to protect it, rightly so, to be able to
Right.
say, yes, but up until this point, because I understand that what you're going to be using is a derivative or a calculation, or I understand that you're going to be anonymizing to such a degree that is beyond what HIPAA would require, that is
Right.
very good anonymization, and that it can even be potentially converted into synthetic data or add some noise to it. So the data scientists come in and are able to help with the solutions of that. And so it takes something actually simple, which is having the right parties talk to each other and
Yeah.
tell the story. Think of it as a family dinner time. When you have everybody at the table, everybody tells a story, and now we all heard it and we have a picture of what happened. But if they're all showing up at the table at different times, then
Yeah.
that story doesn't get told. A
That's
text
an
doesn't do it.
amazing analogy. That's awesome. Absolutely. Well, Paula, thank you so, so much for solutioning on the spot with me. This has been a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jess Carter. And don't forget to follow the Data Driven Leadership wherever you get your podcasts and rate and review, letting us know how these data topics and stories are transforming your business. We cannot wait for you to join us on the next episode.